If you have a voice in your head that is kind of like a devil on your shoulder that is constantly saying things like this to you, those aches and pains that you're feeling, probably a serious illness. Something can happen to you at literally any moment that would destroy you financially. It's been 10 minutes and she hasn't responded to your text yet. Probably a sign she's going to leave you for somebody better. Then you're probably doing something that we call catastrophizing. It basically means creating worst case scenarios in your head. And this one can really make you feel like you're going crazy. We are going to take a closer look at what this is, why you might be doing it, and what you can do instead. Catastrophizing is a word that psychologists have probably made up, probably shamelessly. That is when we take a situation and then we make a catastrophe out of it. We create a worst case scenario out of it. It's kind of like making a mountain out of a molehill. That's not to say that the molehill isn't a big deal. It's just to say that it's not actually a mountain. A lot of times when people say they always tend to overthink things and then that causes a lot of anxiety, probably talking about catastrophizing. Or if something small happens and you eventually lead yourself to believe that it's going to turn into a huge deal when in all reality it's probably not, that's catastrophizing. The good news is if you're doing this, it's actually really common and you're probably not going crazy. It's a very human thing to do, but it can definitely make you feel like you're going crazy if left unchecked. The three most common areas I've found that people tend to catastrophize in is finances, health, and relationships, but you can certainly create a worst case scenario out of just about anything. Some of the catastrophizing that I commonly see in health sound a lot like this. You were out in public and you didn't wash your hands before you ate. You probably caught something that's contagious that's gonna take a long time to recover from. That scratch in your throat, yeah, that's definitely gonna turn into a cold. You're about to feel really awful for about the next 3 or 4 weeks. That fatigue that you're feeling, there's a good chance that's a sign of something really bad going on. Better get that checked out right away. That can't be good. Some of the ones in finances sound like this. That funny noise that your car is making probably means something is really, really wrong. It's probably gonna cost a lot of money to fix that. That mistake that you made at work, your boss is probably gonna find out. And how secure is your job, really? Now you're running pretty late. You're probably gonna show up late to work. Your boss is probably gonna find out about it, and I don't think he's gonna like that. What does that mean? Some of the ones in relationships go a lot like this. Pretty sure your friend just gave you a pretty weird look during that last conversation you had. What could that mean? Have you done something to offend them? Are they annoyed with you? Are you about to be on the outs with them? You should probably think about that. Your coworkers were acting a little bit suspicious. Do they know something that you don't? Your loved ones seem to be acting a little bit off toward you. That's probably a sign that something deeper is going on. Better to freak out about it now rather than wait and find out what's going on. Now, there are a lot of different factors in why a person might do something like this. One big one is that some people are actually genetically predisposed to have the tendency to think this way. Maybe they got the trait from their mother, or maybe they got the trait from their father, or maybe they got the trait from a combination of both. And for whatever reason, then they naturally have a predisposition to overthink things, to create worst case scenarios out of a lot of things. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that something is wrong with them. It's a genetic trait. Just like they got blue eyes or green eyes, they also have this tendency to overthink things more than, say, the next person does. Another huge factor that I see quite a bit that contributes to worst case scenario thinking is if people have been through some kind of physical or emotional trauma. If you've actually experienced something really bad happening, then you know on an experiential level that bad things do happen to normal people. And knowing that means you're more likely to believe and anticipate bad things happening at some time in the future. Even based on little events. You've experienced bad things happening, you no longer have the luxury of believing that bad things don't happen, and it now might make you more likely to create worst case scenarios out of even small events. All right, to sort of use the brain to demonstrate what I'm talking about, we're gonna use our little friend Scolito here. We're gonna use the right side of his brain in particular, because that's where a lot of creativity comes from. Takes some creativity to generate some of the worst case scenarios that we sometimes generate. So if you look at this model of the brain, we have vast networks on the cerebral cortex that are devoted to thinking, to generating thoughts. It's very evolved and we've gotten really good at it, for better and for worse. So a lot of times what happens is we might think a particular thought, think of something bad happening, and then that sends messages down to the limbic system, the emotional brain, which you can't see well here, but it is sort of in this area right down here, parts on each side of midline of the brain. So we start to think some things, it gets the emotional brain going, and that emotional brain then feeds back information and influences what we think. And then we start to think even bigger worst case scenarios, and we pull more thoughts into it. Okay, and then the bigger worst case scenarios send messages back to the emotional brain, which gets the emotional brain amped up. We start feeling some things that aren't great. And then those feelings really confirm to us that what we're thinking is going to happen. They convince us that what we're thinking is true. So then it becomes this feedback loop between the parts of our brain that we think with and the emotional brain, the pinballs back and forth, and we start to generate these worst case scenarios. Now, one major problem with it, to quote a PhD I took a training from, is we have entire portions of the brain dedicated to making stuff, I'm going to say stuff, up. He used a much more clinically sophisticated term, but we have entire regions of the brain dedicated to making stuff up. We're very creative as human beings, right? So the worst case scenarios we can generate can get really creative. They don't have to be realistic, especially when the emotional brain starts making us feel like things are true. So in this sense, the brain can kind of be working against us. Our own creativity can be working against us, generating some feelings that get sent down to the body, and all of this together makes us believe some of these worst case scenarios that we come up with in our mind. Another way the brain works against us is that it sort of works on its own algorithm in a way, so to say, kind of like the algorithms that Facebook and Amazon use. So if you go to Amazon and you want to buy a pink fluffy bunny and you punch in pink fluffy bunny, Amazon brings up all kinds of pink fluffy bunnies, and then next thing you know, you're getting suggestions for purple fluffy bunnies and maroon fluffy bunnies, all kinds of things similar to that, or pink fluffy kitties or pink fluffy puppies. Or if you go on Facebook and you punch something in, suddenly a lot of related things keep showing up in your feed. So they do this obviously so it makes it easier for them to show you what you want. It's designed to streamline processes so that it burns less energy by making things easier for you. It does so by creating new neural pathways. The more you do something, more connections from one brain cell to the next, so that those messages can fire easier. Your body can do things without thinking about it, without burning energy, just streamlined. So if you think about how much you used to have to think about driving a car, how much you had to pay attention, think about every movement, compared to how easy it is to do it now and do other things while you're driving a car and be thinking about something completely different, that's a good example of how the brain has streamlined that process. It's taken a complicated process, created a whole lot of neural pathways to make that process easier, to the point that it doesn't burn a whole lot of brain energy. Now you don't even have to think about it. So to go back to creating worst case scenarios, the more you think about these worst case scenarios, the more that tells the brain, hey, this person really wants to focus on this thing. So I'm going to go ahead and make it a lot easier to focus on this thing by just shoving up these things. Here's what I think you want to see based on your viewing history and your browsing history. You keep thinking about pink fluffy bunnies, I'm going to go ahead and throw up pink fluffy bunnies into your mind to where you're thinking about it in your sleep even. Okay, it thinks it's doing us a favor, and then sometimes it is, like when we need to learn how to drive a car, but when the things that we're focusing on are really bad worst case scenarios that generate a ton of anxiety, our brain actually works against us. It doesn't necessarily know it's causing us a lot of suffering. It thinks it's making some things easier and more streamlined for us. So in that sense, even though our genetics or our environment make us more disposed to catastrophizing, we ourselves can make that even worse based on how we respond to that. All right, so there are a lot of different things you can do to start managing your catastrophizing. This won't be an exhaustive coverage of all of them, but one of the most important things that you can do is to not put a lot of energy into it, to not engage with these thoughts. Remember how we talked about the brain algorithm? The more energy you put into it, the more your brain is going to feed them up to you because it thinks you're interested in that because you're putting a lot of energy into it. Whether that's energy avoiding the thoughts or whether that's energy actively listening and paying attention to the thoughts. So either way, if you're avoiding them or if you're listening to them, you're becoming entangled with them, putting a ton of energy in. The brain is like, hey, I'm going to streamline this thought process and it's going to make it easier. It's going to start feeding up these worst case scenarios to you all the time. So the trick is not put a lot of energy into it. Now, the way I go about that is to recognize that I'm doing it, be aware of it, and sort of externalize the fact that I'm doing that. Meaning, give it a name, give it a label, call it a voice, call it a devil on your shoulder. That's what I have this guy for. You can imagine what it looks like if you want. Notice some of the typical things that it tells you, whatever. Give it a persona. In other words, it's not just a part of you, it's not reality, it's just this thing you do. It's this catastrophizing voice, it's this devil on your shoulder. Then again, you don't want to wrestle with it, become entangled with it. What you want to do is calmly acknowledge, oh, I'm doing it again. That's interesting. And then carry on with whatever it is you are going to do anyway, even if it's in the presence of some of these lingering, catastrophizing thoughts. It would be nice if we could make them go away, but again, we're not trying to do that. We're not trying to avoid them. We're not trying to force them out of our mind because that takes a lot of energy. We're trying to acknowledge them and just calmly carry on with whatever we were doing anyway. Oh, I'm having these thoughts again. That's curious. Of course I am. I do that quite a bit. Kind of expected that I was going to, and all right, well, that's okay. Not ideal, not completely pleasant, but all right, it's not gonna kill me. I'm gonna carry on doing whatever I was doing anyway, even if it's in the presence of some of these thoughts, even if I'm kind of distracted by some of these thoughts. Makes my quality of day at about a 90% versus 100%, but hey, I can live with 90%. That won't kill me. I would prefer 100%, but hey, it's not 0%. So I know in some ways that can seem like too simple of a solution, but at the same time, it is a good illustration of what you want to do with catastrophizing. You don't engage with it, become entangled with it. You don't put a ton of energy into engaging with the thoughts or into forcing them from your mind or into avoiding them. You just calmly acknowledge them, recognize them as just something that you do, an external persona maybe, an internal voice you have, and calmly carry on with what you were doing. All right, so that is catastrophizing. Really normal human behavior, definitely one that can make us feel crazy. One of the many answers to it is acceptance, accepting that you're doing it and calmly carrying on with what you were doing anyway.